growing up in Hawaii, where the population is majority Asian, there truly is no glass ceiling for Asian people. All the politicians, all the CEOs, even the football players are all Asian.
You said you've knocked on over 35,000 doors.
The housing shortage in Hawaii is the single biggest barrier to having a good life. I think what a lot of people in their 20s who are very career-oriented like I was are missing is how much your family, your kids, your partner, how important that is in your life and your mission and your values and your goals.
Today on the podcast, we have my close friend, husband, and now father, but also Hawaii State Senator Stanley Chang. I'm sure we'll dive into your political career, the housing crisis, but just to start off, would love to hear a story or two about your childhood, growing up in Hawaii, and what was it like to be a young Stanley?
Well, first, it's an honor and pleasure to be here with the two of you. I think the work that you guys are doing is so awesome, and I'm truly inspired by your guests. So it's great to be here. You know, growing up in Hawaii is really special. Until you've been here and spent a lot of time here, I think it's hard to truly understand what makes it so special. I think one of the biggest differences that I had to learn when I ended up going to the mainland for college and law school, and, you know, since then, as I've traveled to other places, is, you know, Hawaii is one of the few places in the world where, you know, there really are very few ethnic and racial barriers or boundaries when it comes to dating and marriage. You know, I just took it for granted growing up that when different types of human beings get together, they do what human beings do, which is to make babies together. And I have since learned that that's actually not the case, right? On the U.S. mainland, you know, African Americans and whites have lived side by side for hundreds of years and have not intermarried, you know, the way that people in Hawaii have. In Singapore, where I've spent some time working on housing issues, you know, Chinese, Malays, and Indians have lived side by side for hundreds of years and have not intermarried the way that people do in Hawaii. But in Hawaii, everybody marries everybody, and it's just not an issue. And it's a land of Hapa babies. I think over 40% of our population is mixed, or Hapa, as we call it. And I think that's one of the really special things about Hawaii that, you know, people may not fully grasp if they're just here for the sand and the surf.
Is there like an initial time or like a first moment when you show up on the mainland and there's this realization that you've been living in this, I don't want to call it a bubble, but like you're on an island where things are done one way and then the rest of the country operates in a different way? What was that like realization?
I think it's subtle, but I think it comes up in subtle ways. And so, you know, growing up in Hawaii, where the population is majority Asian, there truly is no glass ceiling for Asian people. All the politicians, all the CEOs, even the football players are all Asian. And I think that was a real luxury for myself as an Asian person because there was no glass ceiling. One of the things that I remember like very distinctly, because it was the first time I had experienced it, I was at a Bob Dylan concert with my friend, my college roommate, who was a really big Bob Dylan fan. And, you know, I'm a music guy. I love music. And I wasn't a huge Bob Dylan fan, but I was like, you know, I'll go because I love music and I'm going to go with my friend. And as I looked there in like this arena of like 10,000 people, it sort of occurred to me as I looked around, I was like, oh, wait a second. I am the only Asian person in like, out of this like 10,000 person arena. I was like, I don't think I've ever been in that situation before, you know? But I guess that's how it is, you know, outside of Hawaii. In Hawaii, like most crowds, if not all crowds, are pretty mixed. It's pretty hard to find a crowd of like that has no Asian people in it.
What is it about the culture and the breakdown in Hawaii that you think makes people so apt to intermingle and marry across races and band together?
So this is a question that very few people in Hawaii think about because we just take it for granted. And so I actually didn't have a good answer to that until a few years ago when I talked to a historian. And she came up with the best answer that I've heard, which is back during the 19th century when Western contact happened, the same thing happened in Hawaii as happened across the American continent, which was that the native people lacked resistance to European and American diseases. And so the population of native Hawaiians crashed. And there was a conscious decision made by the ali'i, or the, ruling families of Hawaii, to intermarry, to save the Hawaiian race, basically. And I think that trickled down and, spread throughout society from the lead of the native Hawaiian leaders of Hawaii.
Wow. I love how there's a reason behind things. Even that's not the 100% the reason. I feel like, things have far-reaching consequences. Cool.
Yeah. I mean, that's why I love history. History explains everything.
I can tell just by the way you explained that you grew up in a household of educators. I read that your parents were both educators, and I'm just curious, how did that influence you growing up? Did it help influence you to pursue a career in politics? And if not, or anything else, how did growing up in that environment change you?
That's a great question. I think, I really looked up to my dad growing up. He's since passed away, but he really knew everything. I mean, even now, these issues like climate change, for example, like he would tell me, I would ask like a dumb kid question about like global warming, and he would talk about how like, well, the oceans absorb a lot of carbon and have this moderating effect on climate, and but we don't know how much the capacity is of the ocean to absorb carbon and to moderate climate change. And like that's still true today. Like he knew about all this stuff. Like I remember we would travel together and he would know like the names of every crop that would be growing in every field. And I growing up, one of my favorite memories is most days after school, I would bike with him around the neighborhood, and I would usually spend the time asking questions of him, and he would tell me. And he was a lot older. He was born in 1924, and I was born in 1982 on his 58th birthday. So I think I really gained this like love of learning, either through osmosis or somehow from him. And the way it's affected my career is, so I'm in the state Senate now, and I'm the chair of the Committee on Housing, because housing is the biggest issue in Hawaii, as it is in California, as it is in New York, and many other jurisdictions around the country and around the world. And I wanted to actually try to do something. And one of the problems with housing is that people have all these gut reactions to the issue, and like, oh, if we just kicked out all the outsiders, or if we just taxed all the outsiders, or if we just forced the developers to build cheap housing, then everything would be solved. And I think one of the things that I absorbed from my father as an academic was, well, you should take a look at the jurisdictions that have successfully solved the housing issue. And so when I first became the chair of the Housing Committee, I traveled to Singapore, I traveled to Vienna, which are two examples of successful housing systems. And my mind just was completely blown, because the things that they do there are so counterintuitive. And yet, these are successful systems that have successfully solved the problem. And so I think that's one of the big, legacies of this academic background that my dad had.
I think it's always cool when you have politicians that, I think it's mostly the case where they're rooted in the state or the region or the local area that they're representing. You went to Iolani growing up in Hawaii, clearly have a lot of love for the state, as you just try to convince me to fly out there on a whim. I'm curious, like growing up in Hawaii, now living there and serving the people, what have you seen change over those years, for better or for worse?
Hawaii has changed in a lot of ways since I was a kid. I think one thing that in Hawaii, you have this push-pull between our relationship with the outside world. So, for example, before Olive Garden opened in Hawaii, people craved Olive Garden. And there's this tendency in Hawaii to want to be more like the mainland. They have Olive Garden, they have IKEA, they have Trader Joe's, and we don't. Oahu still doesn't have a Krispy Kreme. Things like this. We just got our first Chick-fil-A. That's always big news in Hawaii. But I think now, especially in the pandemic and post-pandemic era, I think the pendulum is swinging back a little bit in the opposite way, because I don't think when I was a kid there was such a backlash to the so-called over-tourism problem. And right now, what you really hear a lot of is destination management, which is a way of, I guess, limiting the number of tourists that come to Hawaii. There's a real deep-seated antipathy towards tourism. I think, part of it comes from the scarcity mentality of Hawaii, where we have such a huge housing shortage that seeing people who are relatively wealthier and who are just enjoying themselves on vacation is very triggering to a lot of people. And I think that nowadays we see a lot of desire to not just see tourism as an economic development opportunity, but as a force of negative change. And we need to reclaim it for local people.
I feel like we might as well just dive in to your expertise and what you've dedicated your life to. Well, I want to start at the beginning of this journey. I actually don't know where it starts. So maybe my first question is, can you think of that initial moment, or maybe it was a series of events where you realize, well, it's probably two realizations. The first being that you want to pursue politics, but also the separate one that you want to focus on housing. Were those even separate realizations, and how did those come about?
They were separate, but they were linked. So I think fundamentally the reason why I wanted to be in politics was because my parents were both immigrants. They had come to Hawaii with nothing. My dad was able to buy a house, to put my brother and me through school, to retire comfortably. And for me to buy the house that he bought, he was a professor, so he was a state employee with one salary. For me to buy the house that he bought in 1983 as a state employee today would cost over 40 years of my entire salary. So that life that he was able to build is completely out of reach for myself, and even more so for the generations after me. And so when I actually did end up getting involved and did become, a state senator, housing was the main issue that I wanted to work on because it was the biggest obstacle in Hawaii. And, we now have 7 straight years of population decline. We have one of the fastest rates of population decline in the country. We have the highest rate of people working 2 or more jobs in the country. We have the highest rate of both parents working in the country. As a state, we wake up the earliest of any state in the country, I think in large part because of the number of people with 2 jobs. And I think, it is no longer possible for a young person to have a good job, to raise a family, and to have a good life here, the way that it was possible for my dad, who was an immigrant who came here with nothing. And so that's really why I wanted to get involved, because politics is the arena that we have, for better or for worse, in our society, to address big societal issues like this.
I'm curious, as a representative state senator, how do you get your information? I always wonder that, because I always wonder, how does my feedback or how what I experience in the day-to-day in my community get bubbled up to the legislative level or the state governments? So I'm curious, how do you have your ear to the ground, and how do you know what are the big problems that people are facing?
So there are a lot of ways to do that. Over the course of my elections, I've knocked on over 35,000 doors. So I've talked to a lot of people individually, one-on-one, about what they think the biggest issues are in our community. And you'll find that the biggest issues are really local issues. So back in 2010, when I first ran for city council, the number one issue was our roads, and they were really in disrepair. And so we put a lot more funding into the road budget. And as a result, you have a lot better roads today than we did, in 2010 or 2009. Of course, we see the media, we see social media, we see neighborhood boards. We have all the kind of usual sources for information. But I think one of the things that surprised me when I actually got into office was not just that, I think the broader community, the broader public is aware that, the press will do investigative reporting, or, people will write emails or call their members of Congress or their state elected officials or whatever. But one thing that I didn't fully appreciate at the time was how much the elected legislators rely on the departments of the state government. So, when we're working on, for example, a housing bill, for most of my colleagues, they're primarily relying on the state housing agencies to give them feedback. Is this a viable idea? Can we do that? Can we do this? Will this make a difference? Will that not make a difference? And I don't think that the general public is as aware of how dependent legislators are, because the reality is, we only have 2 year-round staff for us as Hawaii state senators. The pay is very, very modest. So if I have a question about some, housing policy, the Hawaii State Planning Act that got passed in 1978, for example, like I can't, there's no one I can ask in the legislature. If I need subject matter expertise, I kind of do have to go to the state executive branch, and I do have to rely on them. And that, I think, is one of the weaknesses of the legislative branch, is that we don't have a lot of institutional knowledge. There is turnover. And if I, as the new housing chair, have questions, they're usually, it's hard to find somebody who can answer those questions. And I think that that is part of the, in some instances, it can feel that there's a real imbalance where the executive branch holds a lot of the cards and the legislative branch does not.
You said you've knocked on over 35,000 doors cumulatively over your career. And so I'm curious, maybe in that first election when you're a newcomer and you're the underdog in this situation, and I imagine you're also wearing like proper dress shirt, pants under the hot Hawaiian sun. What's going on in your head as you walk from house to house? And also, like, the homes could be spaced apart because people have big yards. What's going on in your mind?
I can see you've done a lot of homework, Matt. Yeah, that was definitely my uniform for years of my life, just going door to door. And I think even though it sounds tedious, and it is tedious, it can be very repetitive. Knocking on doors and talking to voters directly is in some ways the most rewarding part of the whole thing, because you do get a lot of encouragement and positive reinforcement. And, a lot of it is, I'm definitely going to vote for you. Or, wow, no one has ever come here and I've lived here for 30 years. And you're the first person to knock on my door and ask me what I think. And then a lot of it is just knowing that if your opponent is not out there, that you are, as I tell candidates now, every moment that you're not walking and knocking on doors is a moment you are losing the election. And knowing that your opponent is not doing that to the same level of intensity as you is also, positive reinforcement. But that being said, it can be very lonely at times too, because of course it's not all positive. There's a lot of, politics inherently is a divisive sport, and there are people who are going to disagree with you. That's just the nature of the democratic process. And you're also just putting yourself out there to be judged. And even down to your closest friends and family members are going to be there and offering opinions on, why did you wear this shirt today? I saw your opponent at that event. Why weren't you out there? And that stream of feedback can be stressful, can be triggering. And so that can be, one of the downsides. But I think overall, the process of knocking on doors is a really, really positive one. And I can often tell among my colleagues, like those who have done it and those who haven't, because those who have done it, I think are just sort of more deeply understand the constituency and like what real people in their constituency are like, as opposed to whatever the issue du jour is.
As a state senator, or even back when you were a city council member, how much of your platform / what your office has to do is in service of what people want, and how much of it is in service of what you believe people need? I think about the example of when you're a kid and your parents say, eat your vegetables, and you're like, I don't want it. So I know it's inherently important for you to be serving the needs of the people, but also like as someone with a higher view, obviously trying to study it from different countries and to introduce better policy, change is always going to be hard. So I'm curious how you balance people want versus what you think people need, if that even is a discrepancy.
Yeah, I mean, that's a perpetual, balance that you have to strike in office, because you are there, to represent the people and your district. That's what your job is to fight for your constituents. And if your constituents want something or they don't want something, you are their voice. And that's why they voted for you, and that's why they elected you. On the other hand, there are things that are unpopular, yet that are, for the long-term good or for the good of the state as a whole, that may be unpopular in your constituency, in your specific district. And so, I don't think that there's any easy answer to that. I mean, there are some of my colleagues who are really focused just on their constituents and just on fighting for their district, and they will not. They really do choose to focus on the trees and not the forest almost 100% of the time. And there are people on the other end of the spectrum that focus almost exclusively on the forest and very little on the trees. And then there are people in between. And I think that it does have to be a balance, because I think, if you sort of even draw further back, I think one of the things that you learn is that it's very hard to create change. And the amount of change that is possible to create is really driven by the Overton window, and the Overton window, you can shape it a little bit, but really it depends on the circumstances. So for example, Singapore, which I always talk about as having a great housing system, part of what drove it is that they had a huge fire that left 16,000 people homeless. And so suddenly there was this immediate impetus to just build tons and tons, towers and towers of housing. And so in Hawaii, we have not had that. In California, we haven't had like a huge earthquake, right, that left thousands of people homeless. That would give the governor of California an enormous impetus to just build thousands of units of housing. And we don't have that right now. So, the political environment, that Overton window is really, it really varies at different times. And it can sometimes feel a little bit disempowering, because it can change drastically without the intervention of specific people. So for example, before the pandemic, we had a gentleman named Andrew Yang running for president. He was the champion of something called UBI, right, which was a very popular concept at the time. And he really focused on it. Sure enough, 2020 rolls around, and in this country, we finally get UBI, not because of Andrew Yang and his advocacy, but because of Donald Trump and Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi and Kevin McCarthy, because the facts on the ground have changed to such a drastic extent where there's this huge wave of unemployment. No matter where you are on the political spectrum, even the people who are as far away from Andrew Yang as possible recognize the need to get money into the hands of as many pockets as possible across this country. I think that's one thing that it's easy to lose sight of, both in like the professional political class, those who are in politics as a profession, and also just like in the public, like, oh, why can't, this has been an issue for 30 years. Why can't they do something about it? It's because very often it does depend on like what the circumstances are on the ground.
All right, I feel like we've been like bouncing around, talking about housing in the periphery, but I really want to dive into it now. Like, let's say you're just what's your elevator pitch for the housing crisis in Hawaii? And why is it the most important issue to solve?
So the housing shortage in Hawaii is the single biggest barrier to having a good life. As I mentioned earlier, it will take me 40 years of my entire state salary to buy the home that my father bought with one state salary back in 1983. And we are fast becoming, as I once heard, the land of Google employees and the people who give them massages. And that is not a recipe for a healthy community. We talked a little bit earlier about Native Hawaiians. Over half of Native Hawaiians today live outside Hawaii. Over half of all Hawaii-born college graduates live outside Hawaii. It is really painful to me that every year about 13,000 people graduate from high school in Hawaii. We build only 1,000 to 2,000 units of housing. So we are telling those high school graduates, it's great that you were born and raised and educated here, but now that you are an adult, you have to leave and you cannot come back. This is not your home and will never be your home again. I think that is a fundamental failure of the policymaking process. And our obligation, our fundamental, our most sacred obligation, our most sacred responsibility is to ensure that future generations have better lives than we did. And that is manifestly untrue in places like Hawaii, California, New York. Mm-hmm. So we have to do something. Every other issue comes down to housing. Why do we have a doctor shortage? Because housing is so expensive. Why do we have a teacher shortage? Because housing is so expensive. Whatever the issue is, somehow it all comes down to housing. And that's why we need to stop time. until we do something about housing.
There's a lot of different things, people, reasons to point at for the reason why this problem exists. People talk about the rich Google employees or the people that are coming to Hawaii from the East Coast to retire, or the fact that it's a physical island, or the fact that the state wants to preserve nature. What do you think is the primary issue here?
I think everything that you just said comes together in a phrase that I like to use, which is place attachment. People are very attached to their physical surroundings. And it's a very, very deep psychological phenomenon. And it, goes back to the days when, if you woke up one morning and you saw saber-toothed tiger tracks outside your cave, you would probably be very alarmed, if you see these tracks that were not there the night before. And today, the saber-toothed tiger isn't necessarily the issue, but the issue is more that, if I'm proposing that we build 10,000 units a year of housing, and that we therefore build, 100 towers at a time, I think that is very shocking to people. And it not just shocking, but it triggers people on this very deep psychological level. And so what happened in the 1950s and 60s and 70s was there was a really large economic expansion that was driven in part by World War II, by Korea, by Vietnam, dramatic increase in military expenditures in Hawaii. It was driven by the advent of jet travel, which made mass tourism an option in Hawaii. It was driven by statehood, which drove a large influx of both investment and immigration to Hawaii. And this building boom ensued. And so if you come to Hawaii, you'll see that most of the buildings look like they were built in about 1968, because they were. And then what happens in the 1970s is people are like, oh, wait a second. What happened to that idyllic tropical paradise of palm trees and grass shacks? And they put a real halt to development with a lot of land use regulation in the 1970s. And that wasn't true just in Hawaii, it was true in other places. Oregon being a good example, California being another great example. And so land use became very difficult. It became very, very difficult to build whatever you want. And as a result, housing construction, which was in the 15 to 20,000 unit per year range in the early 1970s, crashed and has never recovered. And now we're building about 1/10 that much housing. We're building about 1,000 to 2,000 units a year. And that's been true for many years now. And so I think the environmentalists of the 1970s got what they wanted, which was a stop to the uncontrolled development of Hawaii. But they also got something that they didn't want, which was that instead of sensible growth in a managed way that was capable of absorbing and housing, the future generations of local people, they got housing production that was so throttled that not even the future generations of local people, such as the native Hawaiian community, are able to make it in Hawaii anymore. And so, the pendulum was in one direction, it swung to the far other direction, it's swinging a little bit back, but it still hasn't swung all the way back. And until, there's we might be getting there now. I'm trying. I'm really hoping that we get there now. But it would, frankly, what would drive faster changes if there was something that just really drastically happened. And we haven't had that drastic natural disaster yet that just makes everyone deeply aware of the need to build new housing. Right now, we're just focused on we just got to kick the, Airbnbs and the wealthy overseas investors and the Californians with their second homes, out of our housing, and that will solve our problem. When that's simply insufficient.
Interesting. So you've touched upon two issues now. One is clearly the supply, the constrained supply of housing due to a much reduced, building rate in the state. And the other part was what you mentioned with how it's much more different and much more expensive for you to own. So there's the competitive price side and the supply side of things. I'm curious, have you thought about from the pricing side what policies around rent control could do also on the other side of the spectrum?
Yeah, so rent control it's an interesting policy, and it can work. And a good example of that is Vienna, Austria, which, I've now visited a couple of times to study their very successful housing policy. 60% of Vienna lives in public housing. That is rent controlled. The rent never goes up. And even the private sector rental housing in Vienna is also rent controlled. So it works there because they never stopped building. So, with exceptions like World War II, but, they just keep building. And so it's possible to do rent control. The problem with rent control is what happens in jurisdictions that we're maybe more familiar with here in the United States, which is when you stop building. San Francisco and New York are two good examples of this. I lived for a year in New York between college and law school, and there's always like this urban, the most desired residence in New York is not like a pre-war Candela co-op on Park Avenue. It is a rent-controlled unit where the lease was initially signed in 1975 in Greenwich Village, and the rent is like $70 a month. And it's like people always have these mythical stories of that magical rent-controlled apartment, and people, and not just that, people have these mythical stories about all kinds of crazy fraud that people perpetuate to hang on to that rent-controlled apartment. I think, when you have a supply-constrained environment like Hawaii, like New York being an example, where that has been unfolding now for several years, rent control creates a group of haves and a group of have-nots. And that, politically speaking, is really not a great outcome. The most successful programs are the ones that are for everybody. And the way I put it is public services are for the public. Public parks, public highways, public schools are all for the public. It doesn't matter how rich or poor you are. It doesn't matter when you signed your lease. Everybody gets it. And that's why, the most successful federal programs budgetarily of all time are Social Security and Medicare, and they are for everybody. Even Donald Trump gets them, which is why even Donald Trump pledges he will never cut Social Security and Medicare. So I think instead of trying to, whether it's rent control or whether it's, current affordable housing policies, we are creating like these lottery ticket programs where a select few get a really rich benefit and everybody else is back in the same position that they started. We should try to create more universal programs like public school, like public parks that will help everybody who wants the help and not just, the select few lottery winners.
You just mentioned Vienna as an example that you compared to, and I frequently hear you use Singapore and Hong Kong as also examples for what might the solution look like. But I want to push back on that and challenge you in the sense that those are international places. They're not in the US. They operate on completely different political systems, economies, and cultures. So I'm wondering, in the US, if you had to give an example or comparison, what city or state is doing it the best, if any?
Yeah, so, that's also a perpetual tension, right? The first feedback we always hear is, well, Hawaii's not Singapore, Hawaii's not Hong Kong, Hawaii's not Vienna. And we shouldn't be. And I agree, we're not. And the last thing I want is for Hawaii to turn into Singapore. Now, that being said, we are turning into Singapore person by person because our young people are moving away one by one to places like Singapore. So that's the reality that we have to deal with. Okay, but back to your question. In the United States, one of the examples that people always cite is Houston. And Houston is the most conspicuous example because Houston is the largest jurisdiction in America that has no zoning. And, one of the things that I just grew up with in Hawaii, taking for granted, was that every inch of ground has to be zoned. It's like it's like the 11th commandment, right? But that's not true. In fact, probably, there are hundreds, if not thousands, if not a majority of the United States is not zoned, believe it or not. Zoning is a new thing. And I don't know if you folks know this, but the first zoning regulation in the United States happened in California. And it was a racist regulation to keep Chinese laundries away from white residences. So zoning has a pretty, and zoning over the years has been used extensively for racial segregation. That is one of the core purposes of zoning in this country over the years. But Houston still does not zoning. It's one of the few large populous jurisdictions that still doesn't have zoning. Now, Houston has for many years, so for 40 years, it's been the fastest growing city in America. and its median home price has been lower than the US national median home price. So demand is sky high, and yet supply is keeping up with that demand, and prices have therefore not escalated. Right? So just focusing on demand is wrong. Right? In places like San Francisco or New York or Hawaii, all we talk about is demand. It is possible to have both very high demand and very high supply, like Houston. The problem with Houston, so Houston's great. I have no problem with Houston, but Houston has some dissimilarities with Hawaii and San Francisco and New York, because Manhattan is an island, Oahu is an island, San Francisco is a peninsula. Houston has no natural barriers. So the greater Houston metro area is now the size of the state of Massachusetts. And the suburban sprawl is infinite in Houston. Now, it works for Houston. I'm not saying that Houston should change. It has rejected zoning many times over its history. But if I were to go to the people of Hawaii and say, my solution is to de-zone Hawaii and to deregulate land use in Hawaii so that, like in Houston, anyone can build anything, anywhere, anytime, including subdivisions on agricultural land or conservation land as far as the eye can see. And therefore, to handle Hawaii's 10,000 unit housing demand, we'll just build, we'll pave over 2,500 acres of undeveloped land every single year. I can assure you that is the last thing that the people of Hawaii want. That is they would burn down the Capitol building rather than see thousands of acres a year paved over of the pristine and agricultural environments that we consider so special and so unique and so ecologically valuable. So yes, Vienna is not Hawaii, and yes, Singapore is not Hawaii. Houston is also not Hawaii. It is really not Hawaii. And so if I thought that Houston were an applicable model to Hawaii, that it were a politically viable model to Hawaii and other jurisdictions like San Francisco or New York that are going through huge housing shortages, I would be the first person to champion it. But it's not going to happen, guys.
Tell us a little bit more of your plan for Hawaii. I know that your office newsletter, again, stating that you need about 50,000 units of housing over the next 5 years. How do you intend on, where does that housing live? And, the other thing with building brand new cheap units is in the most simplest model, you're branching further and further out so the people in these affordable units are further from the center of the activity. So I'm curious what your explicit plan or goal is in the next 5 years to sort of achieve some of those numbers.
Yeah, so we have a very specific plan. And it's for the state to take existing state-owned parcels near the rail stations that are currently being built and will begin service, according to the press, by this July, to develop very high-density towers on those parcels and to sell those units to Hawaii residents who would be owner-occupants and who own no other real property for 99-year leases at cost with no profit. So that's a lot of conditions and bells and whistles and provisions, but maybe it's a little bit easier to see if you kind of start with like a decision tree. So, if you start at I think the biggest fork that you have to take is, okay, housing. Do we need to build more or do we not need to build more? As I've already explained, the natural population increase of Hawaii far outstrips the number of housing units that are built. So I think we do need to build more. But that's a significant decision tree because a lot of people, maybe the majority of people would say, no, we don't need to build more. But I think we do. So once you're on that decision tree, we need to build more. Okay, so who is building these units? Is it the public sector or the private sector? Okay, so that's the next split that you have to take. Okay, so I think it should be the public sector. Why? Because the private sector is really good at developing what I just described in Houston. If you deregulate the private sector and allow private developers to build whatever they want, they're going to build suburban sprawl as far as the eye can see, as they currently do in Houston, as they used to do in Hawaii in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Okay, but as I've already said, that's not politically realistic in Hawaii. Okay, we need to concentrate it in the urban core. In the urban core, the state is the largest landowner. Okay. Now we're talking about the state. So we've now narrowed it down to the public sector. Okay. So the public sector, so at this point, there are a number of decisions that you can make, but I think the most important decision that you then have to make is it profit or not for profit? And I think this kind of ties into, I would say, maybe the two key but most non-intuitive, the most counterintuitive things is it has to be revenue neutral and income blind. So when I say public sector housing in America, when I say government housing, public housing, social housing, in America, we immediately think of two things, which are a low subsidized price and a low income resident. Right? Those two things are just, everyone in America takes that for granted. First of all, they're not necessarily wedded. As we see in Vienna and Singapore, you can have a low price with no income restriction. And I think the reason why I think we need that is because the current rate that we are subsidizing housing is $188,000 per unit. Okay, and that's in a recent program that the legislature funded last year called Tier 2 Rental Housing Revolving Fund. It's up to 100% of the area median income, which is a lot of jargon, but it's one of the cheapest forms of subsidized housing that the government has. It still costs $188,000 per unit. Okay, so Hawaii, in order to build 10,000 units a year, would then need to appropriate $1.88 billion, which is like 15% of the state budget. It's just not going to happen. Okay, so we cannot afford a lavish public sector subsidy. Okay, so it cannot be subsidized. So then, if it's unsubsidized, it's not going to be that cheap. And if it's not that cheap, then we can't really have income restrictions on it. You need more of a middle class orientation rather than a low income orientation. And so I'm proposing income blind, revenue neutral housing. And those two things come in a package. And believe it or not, that's what both Vienna and Singapore have. And a lot of people in America that point to, the European model, the Northern European countries, Helsinki, Copenhagen, even Vienna, they often call themselves socialist. They're openly socialist. Red Vienna is one nickname for Vienna. In Red Vienna, they spend zero subsidizing new housing construction. They think it is insane that America would throw billions of dollars at the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars a unit on subsidizing housing construction. And they're openly socialist. So that's how we arrive kind of at this point. And there are a number of other decision trees as well. I think political reality means that we have to, it has to be strictly restricted to local people in Hawaii. And that means Hawaii residents who own no other real property, who are owner occupants. So that's a really key part of the program. But, if you read my bill, it's like a 30-something page bill. Everyone's like, Stanley, nobody's going to read a 30-something page bill, and they're right. But the reason why all those bells and whistles are in there are because of these decision trees. Because it is just not like, every one of these choices is a very clear choice. And I don't feel like we have the option to go the other way, which is why it needs to be so prescriptive.
All right, Stanley, this is the part of the podcast where I play devil's advocate. But in 2 days, I'll see you in person. I'll give you a hug. So your plan on paper makes a lot of sense. And I agree with all the decision trees you walked us through. But you even mentioned that your plan is to build this housing by the rail so that it helps with public transit and all that. But just taking the rail project as an example, it has this track record that has ballooned in cost and the timeline is extended. So back in the fall of 2015, the agency predicted revenue would start in mid-2017. It's now April 2023 and the rail hasn't even opened yet. And in 2012, the budget was $5.2 billion. Now it's moving much slower and the budget has doubled. On the housing side, you said these units that you just talked about would be sold at $400K, which is affordable to a family of four, making $70,500. So if we break down building housing or solving the housing crisis as a timeline from start to finish, I think everything you say until the point of it's time to actually build makes a lot of sense. What makes you believe that the public sector can build these units in this proposed budget and time frame when you look at like a similar example of rail clearly hasn't been working as planned?
That's a great question. And I'm glad I can answer this without eating an incredibly spicy hot wing. But the answer is that there is not that much difference between the public and the private sectors. Okay. In America, we really make a big deal out of the difference between the public and private sectors. In the tech sector, there's this very strong kind of libertarian element where like the private sector is disruptive and the public sector is viewed as holding things back. But the truth is the public and the private sectors are not that different, right? The public sector has a very spotty record of being a landlord for low-income people. The private sector has an extremely spotty record of being a landlord for low-income people. And I think we can all agree on that. The public sector has a very spotty record of delivering big public works projects, big events. The private sector has a very spotty track record of delivering on, big events, big public works projects, and so on. Now, that's on the bigger picture level. So I think one of the key missing ingredients, as we just discussed, is that American public housing has always been underfunded because it has always gone to low-income people. And low-income people have been unable to pay the rents that are sufficient to cover the operations and maintenance and repairs for housing. And as a result, there's this death spiral of poor maintenance, poor conditions, cyclical poverty, stigmatization, and so on. Okay. But you know what happens when public sector is when public housing is privatized? I was on this. This was one of the big decisions when I was on the city council back in the early 2010s, whether the city and county should sell its housing portfolio. The plan from the private sector was to raise the rents and to use that new revenue to pay for the maintenance and repairs. The private sector did not have a magic bullet. They did not have a magic wand. Their only solution was to raise the rent, potentially kick a bunch of people out, and use that money to pay for better maintenance. The plan failed because obviously the low-income residents of that public housing flipped out, as they should have. That was a clear example why it doesn't matter if it's the public or private sectors. Either way, you need revenue to cover maintenance and repairs. And if it's not coming from rent, where else is it going to come from? So there are other specifics. So that's kind of the big picture. On the small picture, I would say, I don't think it's fair to compare housing and towers of housing to big public works projects. And the reason is because individual towers are not that big. Around the world, hundreds of towers are built, thousands of towers are built all the time, every year, right? Rail systems are these, like the elevated rail system that Honolulu is building right now, or like an Olympic Games, are like not that common. But apartment buildings get built all the time. And apartment buildings are even now being built all the time here in Honolulu. And if we build one apartment building, it's not like oh my God, we're doing something that we've never done before. And that has only been done a handful of times in the United States. Apartment buildings are a solved problem. We know how to build them. We've been doing them for a long time. We've been doing them around the world. In Hawaii, we have hundreds of apartment buildings. To build one more is not such a big deal. And then to build another one, and then another one, and then another one, and then, adding up to 100. 100 apartment buildings is not the same. It's just 100 small projects. It's not one big project. So I think that in this case, we're going to be avoiding a lot of the pitfalls of like the big public works projects that, like your Second Avenue subway in New York or whatever.
Interesting. And I also want to dig in about, this proposed idea of your 37-page bill. Yeah, I'm curious how you imagine it would play out over the course of multiple decades. You mentioned how it's a 99-year lease. I'm just curious, will this be available for purchase by families? Does the government want to hold on to the land? How do you intend on, is there going to be a free market for this and people can sell and prices will go up within a few years? Or are there ways to stabilize this so that it can be affordable for the middle class in the long run?
So there are a bunch of different questions there. So one on the 99-year lease thing, the government of Singapore, which does 99-year leases, they've maintained from day one that 99 years and you're out. They're not going to extend them ever. That being said, we've looked and we've tried to find government long-term residential lease programs, of which Singapore is not the only one. Hong Kong, mainland China, Canberra, Australia. Even here in Hawaii, we have something called the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act and Hawaiian Homelands that issue long-term leases. And we have yet to find, other than Singapore, which those leases are only in the 50-something year range because they just started their program in the 1960s. We have yet to find a government residential long-term lease program that came towards the end of the lease without the government extending them automatically. The Hawaiian Homes Commission, they started, I think, in 1920 or 1921, and they've already given automatic extensions to those early leaseholders. So, I think that the government should retain that 99-year right to come in and redevelop if necessary, if there are higher and better uses of the land. But, whatever happens in 99 years, Abe, we're never when are we ever asked to make policy 99 years in the future? I don't think that's fair for us to predict what the world will look like in 99 years. Will we even be above water in 99 years? Who knows, right? You were talking about, and since the 99 years is a long lease term, there's the potential for resale. And so there are a few different ways to handle this resale issue. And I think one of the biggest fears that you already mentioned is that affordable housing needs to remain affordable forever because otherwise future generations are not going to get a crack at it. And that's actually 100% wrong. It's very intuitive, but it's wrong. And I'll tell you why it's wrong. Singapore allows you to sell your unit on the secondary resale market with no restrictions. And you can keep 100% of the upside. You can keep all the profit. So there are units right now that were being sold in the $200,000 to $300,000 range that are reselling for the $1 million range in Singapore. Public housing units. Okay? And that's fine. And the reason why it's fine is because twofold. The first is they keep building new housing that is cheap. So maybe our parents bought that housing for $300,000 when it was cheap, and now it's worth $1 million. And maybe we now no longer can afford that unit. But the government has continued to build and is now building yet more towers at a very low price. As low as $180,000 is now the median price in Singapore today for a brand new unit. So young people can afford that brand new unit. Now that brand new unit is out in the boonies somewhere. So naturally, it's not as many people would want to live out there. But over time, over years and decades, that, once exurban neighborhood is now highly urbanized with a lot of amenities like shopping and schools and infrastructure. And so over time, because it becomes more amenitized, because it becomes more desirable, the price will naturally increase. And that is how every generation can see increasing prices, but every generation still gets access to a very inexpensive home. That's the first reason. The second reason, which is maybe even more important, is that price is not just a barrier to entry. It is a signal. It is a very important signal. Okay? So you're both wearing AirPods right now. If I were to, Matt, you're coming here in a couple days. If I were to give you a gift of earbuds and say, I got this for $20 on Temu, how well, Matt, would you treat that pair of earbuds?
I would list them on Facebook Marketplace right away and hopefully get $20 out of it.
Okay. If I were to tell you that these are now gold-plated, limited edition Apple AirPods that are selling, that are about to launch, they're not even available yet, but they're about to launch for $10,000 a piece, how good care would you take care of those AirPods?
I wouldn't even use them. I would sleep with them every night and tuck them into bed.
Right. It is the exact same principle with housing. Okay? If you have housing that is perpetually affordable, as those good-intentioned, well-intentioned people out there want, you are saying to the world, this is perpetually stigmatized housing. This neighborhood will only ever be for poor people. It will forever be undesirable. If you have housing that appreciates in value, you are now telling the world, this is desirable. Those homeowners will, with pride, take care of their units, and with pride will tell people where they live, and will join the neighborhood watch if there are security concerns, and won't litter on the streets, and will ensure that the elevators are well cared for. That is even more important than the first principle, in my opinion. And that is really overlooked and very counterintuitive, but it is really, really important. And as a result of that, shouldn't we say, look, the historically marginalized, the disproportionately tenant communities in this country are poor. They tend to be racial and ethnic minorities. They tend to have, undesirable jobs. Are we really going to try to create programs that will create neighborhoods that are just stuck in poverty forever? Or do we want them to have the chance at home ownership in a neighborhood that may start low income or moderate income, but then as time goes by, will appreciate in value year after year until they too become very desirable units? That, I think, is really powerful. We can turn those marginalized communities into proud homeowners in desirable neighborhoods in the center of town, surrounded by amenities, a 5 or 10 or 15-minute walk away from every conceivable good and service and product. And those individuals will leave a legacy to their children and their grandchildren that they will be proud to leave. I think that is the vision for our future generations that we should embrace. And the reason I know it's realistic is because it's happened in Singapore and it's happened in Vienna.
I feel like in the US, home ownership is such a strong vehicle for building wealth and stability over time, over generations even, if you pass it down. We have similar vehicles that people are forced to invest in: Social Security, Medicare. You have to just contribute to that. You're forced to. Is there a world where you see us forcing contribution? Or why don't we force contribution towards housing in the long run, like one of these other social goods?
Yeah, so that's what Singapore does, 23% for housing, the way that we have, forced savings for essentially for Medicare and Social Security, for healthcare and for a pension retirement benefit, respectively. I think it could work on a voluntary basis in Hawaii or in the United States, but I don't think that we're close yet to a mandatory withholding the way that we do for Social Security and Medicare, just because, so in America, we spend, the federal benchmark is 30% of your income on housing. In high-cost jurisdictions like the ones that the three of us live in, the average resident is spending way more than 30% of their income. In Singapore, like I said, it's only they're only spending 23% of their incomes on housing, but it is forced. I mean, so it's a very good deal there. They're spending about half their incomes on housing as what we are in our jurisdictions. So it's a really good deal, but Americans don't like taxes and they don't like forced savings. And so I don't, and forced savings looks a lot like a tax. And, politically speaking, it would be very hard to see that coming to fruition in the near future. But I think it could happen as a voluntary opt-out program.
All right, when you're not in the office, when you're not at home, when you're not eating food, you can be found hiking the steps of Koko Head, which is one of the most popular hikes in Hawaii and Oahu. And you're just lathered up in sunscreen. It looks like you're a ghost. You just have like 4 layers of sunscreen on. Why is Koko Head so special to you? Also, I think it's like your only form of exercise, although you do it a lot. You do it like every day. So that's how you stay fit. Why is it so special to you?
Contrary to popular opinion, it's not my only form of exercise. But yes, it is true that I've turned down your invitations to go climbing or to the gym or lifting or what have you many times. So sorry, Matt. I know we can still be friends. But the reason I do love Koko Head is because it is a very efficient workout. If you've ever done it, it's a stairway that just goes straight up the mountain. And so it's intense. Even if you're a very, very fit person, you will be very sweaty and very tired at the end of it. The second reason is because it has such a fantastic payoff at the end. You're at the top of this, very high mountain, and the view is just incredible. And that's, I really enjoy that. So a lot of the hikes in Hawaii, that are good workouts tend to be much longer. You know, Kulio O or Hanama Bay Ridge or Waimano Falls, they're all like, you measure them in the hours. Koko Head, you know, you measure in the minutes. And so I think that's why I really appreciate it.
Your wife, Annie, told me to ask you, what are some of your favorite foods? And then maybe you can tie in a bit of why is food in Hawaii so special? Because at least for me, I think Hawaii probably has the best Asian food in America, better than LA, New York, the Bay. So what's special about food to you?
When I was a kid, I loved cars and I was indifferent to food. But over the years, food has really become a passion of mine. And it's hard to pinpoint one specific food, although I have many. You know, when I was a kid, I really loved bamboo shoots, for example, and I still do. And if we were to broaden it to one cuisine, you know, my family, my mother's side of the family is originally from Shanghai, and the cuisine of Shanghai will always have a special place in my heart, even though I love Cantonese food and Taiwanese food and Japanese food and Korean food and Mexican food, and just like every cuisine out there is just such an incredible universe to explore. And that's one of the great things that you get out of travel is, you know, I had never been to Austria before, and it's not like Austrian food is really famous in America, but when you get to Vienna and you see, for example, the desserts, you know, you learn things, you know, like when we call pastries in America, you know, we think of as like, when we think of like French pastries, like these beautiful croissants and that kind of thing, in France, they call that viennoiserie or Viennese bread. And it's because it's from Vienna. And so when you look at like the baked goods and the desserts of Vienna, whoa, mind blowing. You know, you don't know what you don't know. And so everywhere I go, I'll discover one thing that nobody ever talks about that is just completely mind-blowing. And so another good example of that is, you know, there's so many famous foods in Japan, and every single one of them is, you know, lives up to the hype, whether it's ramen or, you know, sushi or, you know, iseki. You know, there's so many incredible cuisines in Japan. And yet one thing that I've never heard anyone rave about is salad dressing. And yet every salad dressing I've had in Japan is just mind-blowingly good. You know, and so I think food it's like a way of exploring a culture, because of course there are historical, geographic, cultural reasons for, you know, why foods become popular and the significance that food has for people. And just like the taste sensations, there's so much to learn. Like in, for example, the world of wine, they always talk about balancing sugar with acid, sweetness with acid. You can't just have something that's too sweet, because that doesn't, you know, that's not a harmonious on the palate. They always want to balance with acid. I've really gotten into Thai food recently, and in Thailand, sweetness is always balanced with salt. There's very few desserts in Thailand that are just straight up sweet, like cotton candy. You know, there are a lot of desserts in Thailand that are balanced with salt, and that is really, really interesting. All these Thai desserts that balance very, very delicately on the edge of sweet and savory. And, you know, you talked about Hawaii food and Hawaii cuisine, and one of the great joys of cuisine is discovering authenticity. And I know authenticity is a very unfashionable word these days when it comes to food. But, you know, I once posted on social media that was super controversial and everyone jumped on it, that it is impossible for food to cross a border. But it is true. It's very hard to find true authenticity in food, you know, in a different place other than where it is served. And it's not just, even if you have the exact same ingredients and the exact same preparation, it's just a different relationship, that societal and cultural relationship. I was just at a ramen bar with Annie, with my wife, that the ramen was actually quite close to what you would get in Japan, but the lights were low, the music was loud and bumping, it was very Instagrammable, and I was like, you know, this is not culturally the same relationship to ramen that the Japanese people have with ramen. And so, you know, when you come to Hawaii, as I sincerely hope you do, Abe, I know, Matt, you're going to be here in a couple of days, and Abe, one of the first things you're going to discover is the relationship that we have in Hawaii to one of our most famous foods, which is poke. Okay, on the mainland, poke is kind of a trendy food. You get it with, you know, on top of rice with a bunch of other, like, you know, ingredients like edamame or maybe seaweed salad or diced mango or whatever. And it's eaten almost like a bibimbap. I guess I would call that a bibimbap with poke in it. A Korean person would recognize that as bibimbap. In Hawaii, actually, poke served on top, a poke bowl is a fairly recent phenomenon. The true way poke is served is it's marinated, it's pre-made and marinated. It's just fish and with some additional ingredients like seaweed, the crunchy, seaweed that we have here in Hawaii that we call limu, maybe a little bit of diced onion, a little bit of sesame seed, a little, some flavorings like soy sauce or shoyu oyster sauce or, the spicy mayo that you might get with the spicy ahi poke. But it's really all about the fish. And the traditional way you buy it is by the pound. And the traditional way you eat it is as a pupu or as an appetizer at a party. You with a bunch of other things. So you don't eat it on top of rice as a main course. You eat it with a bunch of other things at a party or at a luau. And when I went to the mainland, I realized why the mainland doesn't do it this way is because, as it turns out, Hawaii has the country's largest long-line fishing fleet, which means deep-sea fish, which means even in California and New York, other coastal jurisdictions, the quality of the tuna, which is a deep-water fish, is just not as good as it is in Hawaii. And in Hawaii, the focus is on the fish and appreciating the taste of fish. And when mainlanders come to Hawaii and ask where the best poke is, most Hawaii people will respond with like the name of a supermarket. Because in Hawaii, all the supermarkets have good poke. It's not like there's only a handful of places with good poke that's really fresh. All the supermarkets have good poke that's really fresh. And on the mainland, having eaten poke on the mainland that really is not fresh, I now appreciate just how lucky we are in Hawaii to have just access to incredibly good quality fish. But it's not just that. I mean, the authentic Japanese food is really special. And, we have a critical mass of a Japanese population here in Hawaii that understands what the foods are supposed to taste like. There are restaurants here in Hawaii. Many of them are chains that were founded in Japan that have most, if not all, their locations in Japan that have outposts here in Hawaii that are really, really, truly presenting the food in an authentic way. And I guess by authentic, I mean, I'm thinking of this one restaurant that has a fantastic lunch special that is so authentic. It is all I can think of is this really old movie called Babette's Feast, which is from like the 1970s or 80s, which you should watch. It's a great movie, but I just imagine this chef, this Japanese chef who is trained in the very old-fashioned ways of cuisine with all these techniques that you never see Americans eating in like teriyaki, Americans like teriyaki or whatever. Right? All these things with like tofu, soybean, leaves or whatever. You're just like, weird seaweeds that are brined and pickled, all this stuff that you would get in Japan, like organs of animals that would never be served at a high-end restaurant. But I imagine this chef in the back, creating this food from his heart. What he ate growing up, what he learned at the hands of, a master chef in a tiny kitchen in Showa period Japan, and that cultural. When I eat a meal at this restaurant, it's almost like a tribute to this deep and rich cultural heritage that it comes from. It's not just the food itself, but in the food you can see the hundreds of years of history and then the care. Everyone, whenever you ask a chef what their secret ingredient is, they always say love, because it's true. It's a cliche, but it's true. The love, the care that they took to prepare it the old-fashioned way instead of taking the shortcut with the food processor or the pre-made mix. That love, you really can taste the difference in Japanese food, in local food, in poke, in shave ice. And if Hawaii were not so famous for its perfect weather and its beautiful scenery, I believe that it would be world famous for the unequaled, the peerless cuisine that we have here. And I hope that every one of your listeners and viewers comes out to Hawaii to experience it for yourself.
Stanley, what would be your parting words to our audience? What would you say to them when it comes to what you care about and sort of your life mission?
So, I've listened to some of your episodes, and your guests are just so inspirational because they've achieved so much at a young age, and you can tell with a lot of them, including the two of you. I know you, Matt, pretty well, are very mission-driven and goal-oriented, and success is a really big part of the of the life outlook and goals, the vision that one has for their life. And I was actually just talking to a new friend yesterday about this, and how they wanted, for example, their life partner to be a big part, to understand, but also to support and to, help advance their primarily career-oriented mission. And I think one of the things that I've learned, having gotten married and now having a kid recently, is that, I used to be just like that. My overriding desire in life, and one of the main reasons I got into politics, was this fear that I would have lived and died on this earth without it having mattered. And I wanted to leave a mark on the world. And I've since come to realize that is really hard. Some people do it, like Napoleon, but how many Napoleons are there? And what are the chances that you are Napoleon? The chances that you are Napoleon are quite small. And even Napoleon, I've read a lot about geology, and I think one thing that those of us who are anxious about the environment and about climate change, 3 times in the last 100,000 years, your home island, Abe, of Manhattan, has been covered with glaciers. And what does that mean? It means that the entire island, everything above the ground, has been ground to a fine powder. The next time that Manhattan is covered with glaciers, the same thing will happen. And the only trace that humans were there in that layer of powder, of dust, is that it will be slightly reddish because of the iron content in the skyscrapers. So, 100,000 years is a blink of a geological eye, and even Napoleon will be lost forever, will be lost to the mists of geology in 100,000 years. And what is really important in life is not becoming the next Elon Musk or Napoleon. It is your family. It's your life partner. It's your kids. Those things are really, really powerful. And it's hard. Like, I don't know if there's anything I could have told my pre-fatherhood self about what it's like to hold your own child and to have your own child. And, the dopamine you get when your kid laughs, even if they laugh at you 20 times a day, when they do it the 21st time, it's just an incredible shot of like dopamine. And I know your audience is super career oriented and very high achieving and is going to conquer the world and start the next, multi-bazillion dollar unicorn and, fly to the moon like Jeff Bezos or whatever. But I think what a lot of people in their 20s who are very career oriented like I was are missing is how much your family, your kids, your partner, how important that is in your life and your mission and your values and your goals. And it is very, very possible to be a stay-at-home parent, do nothing but raise your kids and have a very happy and fulfilled life. That is very, very realistic. But to be, somebody who just spends their time building a great company and like looking back on their deathbeds, Lee Iacocca, one of the things that I absorbed from him when I was a kid reading his books is, no one on their deathbed wishes they spent more time at the office. And I'm starting to see why. And in this generation, you now have more options than ever to meet life partners. You have apps, you have meetups, you have mixers, you have friends of friends. It's so easy. You have matchmakers. There's so many ways to do it. And I know your listeners are probably very high achieving people who have very high standards for their life partners. And yes, it is a numbers game, but that game is the most important game that you will play in your entire life. And I know that because I've seen it happen in my own life.
Your closing statement explains a lot of why you ask me the same couple questions every time we hang out. But I think it's good that you're always helping to steer me in the right direction. So I appreciate that and appreciate you coming on the podcast, and looking forward to spending some in-person time with you in just 2 days. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much, Stanley. You brought so much knowledge and depth to the conversation. I actually learned a ton out of all this, and not to mention, love the way that you can speak deeply, whether it's housing or a bowl of poke. So I'm going to love the passion that you have for what you do and what you have around you.
Well, thank you guys so much for having me on this pod. I've learned a lot from the pod already. I've learned a lot from you as people, Matt, from you over the years, Abe, I look forward to getting to know you better, but I really appreciate how hard you're working for the community and for your listeners and for leading an incredibly powerful intelligent, ambitious generation to achieving their best selves and realizing their full potential. It's so inspiring to me.
Thanks, Stanley. Appreciate that.
Thank you.